The morning light slid through the half-closed blinds of Roosevelt High School, painting thin stripes across the dusty floor. The hallway echoed with the dull rhythm of footsteps and locker doors slamming shut, a sound that felt more like obligation than routine. Students moved in clusters, whispering in low tones, careful not to attract unnecessary attention. Mrs. Marlene Drake stood at the entrance of room 207, her arms folded tightly against her chest. She wasn't an old teacher, but there was something about her presence that carried the weight of someone who had been hardened by years of quiet resentment. Her sharp eyes scanned the room the way a scanner reads a barcode, efficient, detached, but searching for something out of place. "Sit up straight, and no noise today," she said flatly, her voice neither loud nor soft, just heavy. It wasn't a request, it was a verdict. In the back row, Darius sat quietly. His brown skin seemed to catch the sunlight in a way that made him stand out without trying. He wore the same pressed uniform as everyone else, neat and proper, but his stillness was different. He wasn't restless like the other boys. He wasn't distracted. He just existed there, silent. Mrs. Drake's eyes paused on him for a fraction longer than on anyone else. She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. Her gaze already carried a judgment. "Darius," she finally spoke, her tone sharp, like a blade lightly grazing the edge of a surface. "Where's your homework?" He lifted his head slowly, meeting her eyes. "I turned it in yesterday." His voice was calm, steady, but soft enough that the front row barely heard him. Mrs. Drake tilted her chin slightly, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile that wasn't kind. "Yesterday? I don't recall seeing it." "I placed it on your desk after class," he replied, still even-tempered. The class grew quiet, but not the normal quiet of paying attention. It was that heavy silence that settles in when everyone senses something about to shift. Mrs. Drake stepped closer, heels clicking on the linoleum floor. "Are you suggesting I lost it? That I don't know how to keep track of my own papers?" "No, ma'am," Darius said, his eyes lowering for just a second before lifting again. "I'm saying I turned it in." That second of silence that followed stretched too long. The students in the room exchanged quick glances, a few biting their lips. They'd seen this pattern before. Mrs. Drake straightened up, her voice cutting through the still air. "Pack your things. If you can't follow simple expectations in this classroom, you don't belong here." A murmur ran through the room. Someone in the middle row whispered, "But he didn't do anything," and was instantly silenced by Mrs. Drake's sharp look. Darius didn't move immediately. His hands rested on his notebook, fingers still. He didn't plead. He didn't argue. He simply said, "May I ask why?" Mrs. Drake's tone dropped even colder. "Because this classroom doesn't tolerate excuses. Leave." The tension in the room thickened. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They wanted to speak up, but didn't dare. Slowly, Darius began packing his bag. The scrape of his chair against the floor felt louder than anything else in the room. As he stood, his calmness unsettled her more than any argument could have. And as he walked toward the door, no one noticed the faint emblem on the corner of his backpack, the discreet seal of City Hall. The hallway outside room 207 was unusually quiet. Darius stepped out slowly, his bag slung over one shoulder, his movements deliberate. Behind him, The muffled sound of Mrs. Drake resuming her lesson seeped through the closed door, like the world inside that room had already moved on without him. He didn't linger. He didn't look back. His footsteps echoed down the empty corridor. On the far end, the vice principal, Mr. Hensley, stood by the bulletin board, tacking up a new flyer about the upcoming parent-teacher conference. He spotted Darius and frowned. "Where are you supposed to be right now?" Hensley's tone was not curious. It was accusatory. "Mrs. Drake asked me to leave class," Darius said calmly. Hensley blinked. "Asked you to leave? Why?" "She said I didn't belong there." The vice principal tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I see." He paused for a moment, studying Darius with a look that felt less like concern and more like calculation. "Wait outside the office. I'll deal with this later." Darius nodded once. He didn't protest, didn't explain further. He just walked toward the main office, his steps unhurried. In the classroom, Mrs. Drake continued her lesson with the same cold precision as before. But something hung in the air now, a residue of discomfort. The students shifted in their seats. A girl in the second row, Emily, chewed on the end of her pencil, her mind not on the math problem written on the board, but on the way Darius had left. When the bell finally rang, the class emptied out into the hallway in a rush of chatter. But the conversation wasn't about the assignment. "Did you see her face? She looked mad for no reason," whispered Caleb. "He didn't even do anything," Emily replied softly. "Don't talk too loud," another boy warned. "She hears everything." Meanwhile, in the main office, Darius sat quietly on the wooden bench. The office secretary, an older woman with gray-streaked hair and a sharp nose, glanced at him over her reading glasses. She didn't say anything, but her eyes lingered for a second longer than they needed to before she returned to her paperwork. Minutes passed. The ticking of the wall clock filled the silence. Finally, the door to the principal's office opened, and Principal Lawson stepped out. A tall man with thinning hair and an air of exhaustion, he looked at Darius with mild surprise. "Darius, why aren't you in class?" Before Darius could answer, Mr. Hensley appeared behind him. "Mrs. Drake sent him out," he interjected quickly. "Said he was being disruptive." "Disruptive?" Principal Lawson's brow furrowed. "This doesn't sound like him." Darius met the principal's eyes steadily. "I turned in my homework yesterday. She said she didn't see it." Lawson hesitated. He knew Mrs. Drake's history. There had been complaints before, subtle ones. From parents who didn't want trouble, from students too scared to speak up, but nothing ever concrete enough to act on. "All right," Lawson said slowly. "Go to the library for now. I'll talk to her." Darius nodded. He stood, his movements calm, collected. But as he left the office, the secretary noticed something no one else did. The faint gold pin on his bag strap. It was the same emblem that hung in the mayor's office. The library was nearly empty when Darius walked in. Rows of shelves stood silent, like sentinels, the faint smell of old paper hanging in the air. He chose a seat near the back, where sunlight filtered through high windows, casting soft rectangles of light onto the carpet. He didn't open a book. He just sat, hands resting on his bag. He could still hear Mrs. Drake's voice echoing faintly in his mind. This classroom doesn't tolerate excuses. Across the room, the librarian, Mrs. Cole, looked up from her desk. She gave him a small, knowing nod, the kind that didn't pry, but quietly acknowledged his presence. She'd seen him here before, during study periods. He was always quiet, respectful. Today, there was something heavier about his silence. Back in room 207, Mrs. Drake stood at her desk during the lunch break, flipping through papers. Her fingers landed on a single, neatly stapled assignment, tucked slightly to the side. The name at the top read, Darius Carter. She stared at it for a moment, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, without a word, she slid it into the drawer of her desk and closed it. Emily lingered near the doorway, hesitant. She wanted to say something, to ask why Darius was treated that way, but the weight of Mrs. Drake's gaze pinned her in place. Finally, Emily turned and left without speaking. Meanwhile, in the principal's office, Principal Lawson sat at his desk, staring at a list of teacher reports. His phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from the mayor's office, a reminder about the upcoming city scholarship ceremony. He sighed, rubbing his temples. The ceremony would bring media attention, and the mayor had been adamant about showcasing the city's commitment to fairness and education. Little did Lawson know, the name Carter was on both lists, the scholarship honorees and the mayor's family contacts. Out in the cafeteria, whispers spread. Students who had seen Darius leave now traded rumors. Maybe he talked back, one boy said. No, he didn't, Emily interrupted, her voice firm. He was calm. She just didn't like his answer. You're going to get in trouble saying that, the boy warned. Emily frowned, but said nothing more. Back in the library, Darius finally unzipped his bag. Inside, between his notebooks, was a small leather folder with the city seal embossed in gold. He opened it briefly, glancing at the letter inside. A personal note from the mayor, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Proud of you always. Don't let anyone make you feel less than who you are. He closed it gently and slipped it back into the bag. At that same moment, Principal Lawson entered the classroom where Mrs. Drake sat eating her lunch at her desk. Marlene, he began carefully, why did you send Darius Carter out of class? Mrs. Drake didn't look up immediately. She dabbed the corner of her mouth with a napkin, then said, he was being disrespectful. Didn't have his homework. Made excuses. Lawson studied her. Are you sure about that? Darius isn't known for causing problems. Her eyes met his, cold and unwavering. He's not the type that belongs in an advanced class. You know that as well as I do. Lawson paused. The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have. He'd heard this tone before, from teachers who never said the word but meant it all the same. And deep down, he knew this wasn't really about homework at all. Principal Lawson didn't respond right away. He let the silence stretch, studying Mrs. Drake's expression. She didn't flinch. Her posture was rigid, her lunch neatly arranged like everything else about her, controlled, measured. Marlene, he said slowly, you've had complaints before, subtle ones, parents saying their children felt singled out in your class. Mrs. Drake let out a soft, humorless laugh. Parents complain when they don't want to admit their kids can't keep up. We can't lower standards just because someone feels uncomfortable. Lawson's jaw tightened. He'd heard those exact words used as shields, words that sounded professional, but carried something unspoken underneath. "I'll review this," he said finally, his tone neutral. "In the meantime, Darius will wait in the library." When Lawson left, Mrs. Drake sat back in her chair, staring at the closed drawer where Darius's assignment now lay hidden. She didn't move to retrieve it. Down the hall, the library remained quiet. Darius leaned forward, elbows on the table, staring at the muted sunlight on the carpet. He wasn't angry, at least not outwardly. His face stayed calm, but his fingers tapped lightly against the table in a rhythm only he understood. The librarian approached. "Would you like something to read while you wait?" she asked gently. Darius looked up. His voice was polite. "No, thank you. I won't be long." Mrs. Cole gave him a faint smile before returning to her desk. She didn't know exactly what had happened, but she recognized the look in his eyes. It was the look of someone who'd been dismissed unfairly, but refused to be broken by it. Meanwhile, in the cafeteria, the whispers grew louder. "I heard Mrs. Drake kicked him out." "Why? He's one of the smartest kids in the class." "Maybe she just doesn't like him." Emily sat at a corner table, staring down at her tray. She wanted to tell the truth, to say that Darius hadn't done anything wrong, but she also knew how things worked in this school. Speaking up didn't always make things better. It just made you the next target. Principal Lawson made his way back to his office, his mind restless. He opened his email again, glancing at the message from the mayor's office. Tomorrow's scholarship ceremony would be a big event. He scrolled through the list of honored students. His eyes paused when he saw the name. Darius Carter, Academic Excellence, Roosevelt High School. Lawson froze. The surname Carter was common enough, but he remembered now. The mayor's only son attended Roosevelt High. Could it be the same boy? Back in the library, Darius pulled out his phone. A single unread message from his father said at the top of the screen, "I'll pick you up today. We need to talk before the ceremony." He locked the screen and slipped the phone back into his bag. His calmness never wavered. At that moment, Mrs. Drake appeared in the doorway of the office. She had come to follow up on the incident. "Where is the boy now?" she asked curtly. "In the library," Lawson replied, his tone clipped. Mrs. Drake folded her arms. "He shouldn't return to my class. It disrupts the learning environment." Lawson met her gaze with a long, measured look. "I'll decide that." Something in his tone made her pause. Meanwhile, Darius sat in the quiet library, waiting. And the faint gold seal on his bag caught another ray of sunlight, gleaming for just a moment, unnoticed by anyone except Mrs. Cole. The afternoon bell rang, releasing students into the hallways like a flood of restless energy. Laughter and chatter filled the corridors, but in the library, it remained calm, as if the noise couldn't quite reach that far. Darius stayed seated at the same table. His posture was steady, almost unnaturally composed for someone his age. He didn't glance at the clock, didn't shift in his seat. He just waited. Outside, Principal Lawson stood near the office window, staring down at the courtyard where students milled about. His mind replayed the conversation with Mrs. Drake. The way she said, "He's not the type that belongs in an advanced class." He'd brushed off similar comments before, telling himself they weren't serious. But now, it felt heavier, harder to ignore. He thought of the scholarship ceremony tomorrow. The mayor would be there, along with reporters and parents. If the boy in the library was who he suspected, Lawson sighed. He turned away from the window and reached for the phone on his desk. In room 207, Mrs. Drake sat alone at her desk. She opened the drawer where she had hidden Darius's homework. She held it for a moment, reading the neat handwriting. It was correct, every answer precise. She stared at it like it was a mirror showing something she didn't want to see. Then quietly, she slipped it back into the drawer and locked it. Down in the library, the door opened softly. Emily stepped in, holding a book in her arms like an excuse. She spotted Darius immediately. "Hey," she said quietly, walking over. He looked up. His face didn't show surprise, just a calm acknowledgement. "Hi." Emily hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was near. I'm sorry about what happened in class." "You don't have to be," Darius replied. His tone was gentle, but there was a firmness beneath it. "She didn't have a reason," Emily said, her voice low. "You didn't do anything wrong." Darius studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Sometimes you don't need a reason. Sometimes just existing is enough." Emily swallowed hard. She wanted to say more, but couldn't find the words. Before she could try, the librarian approached. "Darius, the principal wants to see you," Mrs. Cole said softly. Darius stood, picking up his bag. He nodded politely to Emily before walking toward the door. In the principal's office, Lawson was waiting. He gestured for Darius to sit. "Darius," he began carefully, "I want you to know I'm looking into what happened today." Darius sat down, his face calm, unreadable. "Okay." Lawson hesitated. "I also noticed your name on the scholarship list for tomorrow's ceremony." "Yes, sir," Darius said evenly. Lawson leaned back slightly, his suspicion now certainty. "You're the mayor's son, aren't you?" Darius met his eyes. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out the leather folder with the city seal. He placed it on the desk, silent. Lawson stared at the emblem for a long moment. Everything suddenly felt heavier. The teacher's words, the hidden assignment, the unfair dismissal. And for the first time that day, Lawson felt something close to fear. The weight of silence settled between them like a thick curtain. Principal Lawson kept his eyes on the gold seal embossed on the leather folder. It wasn't just a decorative emblem. It was an unmistakable mark of authority, one that carried the weight of City Hall itself. Darius didn't rush to fill the silence. He didn't need to. His calm, steady presence was enough to make Lawson's thoughts spiral. "I see," Lawson finally said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't realize." Darius tilted his head slightly, his tone even. "Would it have mattered if you did?" The question wasn't sharp, but it cut deep. Lawson looked at the boy, no, the young man, sitting across from him. His face was calm, but his eyes held something older than his years. "It would have changed the approach," Lawson admitted. The words tasted bitter, even as he said them. "Should it?" Darius asked. Lawson didn't answer. He couldn't. At that moment, the office door opened. Mrs. Drake stepped inside, carrying a stack of papers. She froze slightly when she saw Darius sitting there, his bag still at his feet. "I didn't know he'd still be here," she said, her tone clipped. Lawson straightened. "I asked him to stay." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the folder on the desk, then back to Lawson. "We need to be clear about the standards in this school. Disruption can't be tolerated no matter who it is." Darius stood slowly. "What disruption?" His voice wasn't loud, but the question echoed in the room. Mrs. Drake's lips pressed into a thin line. Refusing to take responsibility is disruptive. I turned in the work, Darius said simply. She didn't deny it. She didn't confirm it either. Lawson's gaze shifted between the two. Marlene, he said carefully, where is his homework? Did you check again? Mrs. Drake hesitated for the briefest moment. It wasn't there when I looked. Check again, Lawson said, his tone firmer now. For the first time, Mrs. Drake faltered. Her fingers tightened slightly around the stack of papers in her arms. Then, without another word, she turned and left the office. Lawson exhaled slowly. Darius, I want you to know this will be addressed properly. But Darius didn't look convinced. He adjusted the strap of his bag. It's not about me, he said softly. It's about what happens to anyone who doesn't have a name that protects them. The words hung in the air like a quiet indictment. Will you tell your father? Lawson asked, almost reluctantly. Darius didn't answer. He simply gave a small, unreadable smile and walked toward the door. As he stepped into the hallway, Emily was waiting just outside, holding a book tightly against her chest. Are you okay? She whispered. I'm fine, Darius said, though the weight in his eyes said otherwise. Behind them, Mrs. Drake returned to her classroom. She opened the drawer of her desk, pulled out Darius's neatly completed homework, and stared at it again. Her reflection stared back faintly in the glossy paper. For a moment, something like doubt flickered across her face, but then she slid the paper back inside and closed the drawer with a quiet click. Tomorrow, the entire city would know her name. The next morning, Roosevelt High buzzed with an unusual tension. Students whispered in the hallways about the scholarship ceremony that would take place that afternoon. Rumors swirled. Reporters were coming. The mayor himself would speak, and cameras would be everywhere. Emily sat at her desk in room 207, watching Mrs. Drake move stiffly around the classroom. The teacher's usual sharpness was there, but something about her seemed unsettled today. Her eyes darted to the door more often, and her movements lacked their usual precision. The bell rang and students settled. Mrs. Drake began the lesson, her voice clipped and mechanical. Halfway through the period, the door opened. Principal Lawson stepped inside. Mrs. Drake, he said, his tone calm but firm. I need to see you in my office. Now. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. Can it wait until... No, Lawson interrupted. It's important. The students exchanged glances as Mrs. Drake set down her marker and followed him out. The room hummed with quiet curiosity the moment the door closed. Meanwhile, in the principal's office, Lawson gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. On the desk lay Darius's homework, neatly completed, every answer correct. I found this in your drawer, Lawson began, his voice steady. Care to explain why it wasn't graded? Mrs. Drake's lips tightened. I must have overlooked it. Overlooked? Lawson repeated slowly. Or decided it didn't matter? She straightened, her chin lifting slightly. You're reading too much into this. One missing paper doesn't justify expelling a student from your class, Lawson cut in. Especially one with a spotless record? She said nothing. Lawson leaned forward. Do you know who Darius Carter is? A flicker of confusion crossed her face. He's a student, a bright one, I admit, but he's also the mayor's son, Lawson said, his voice dropping. Mrs. Drake froze. For the first time, her composure cracked. "The mayor's son?" "Yes," Lawson said. "And today, the mayor will be here, along with the press, for the scholarship ceremony. Darius will be honored on stage. Everyone will be watching." A long silence stretched between them. "I suggest," Lawson continued, "you consider how you plan to explain yesterday's actions, because if you don't, someone else will." Mrs. Drake swallowed hard, but didn't reply. Meanwhile, in the cafeteria, Darius sat quietly with Emily. She fiddled with the edge of her lunch tray, unsure what to say. "Are you nervous about today?" she finally asked. "No," Darius replied. His voice was calm, but there was something distant in it. "I've been on stages before. Cameras don't change anything." Emily hesitated. "Do you think she knows who you are now?" Darius gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It doesn't matter who I am. It matters who she thinks I'm not." Across the school, preparations for the ceremony began. Teachers straightened chairs in the auditorium, and a banner hung over the stage. "Celebrating Academic Excellence, Roosevelt High Scholarship Awards." Mrs. Drake returned to her classroom later that period. She didn't say a word. She simply stood at the front, her eyes unfocused, as if the weight of what was coming pressed invisibly on her shoulders. Tomorrow's headlines were already writing themselves. By midday, the auditorium was already half full. Rows of polished chairs gleamed under the soft stage lights. A podium stood at the center, draped with the school's crest and the city's seal. Local news crews set up cameras in the back, while a few reporters scribbled notes, murmuring quietly among themselves. Behind the stage, Principal Lawson adjusted his tie nervously. He scanned the list of honorees one more time, his eyes pausing on the name that now felt heavier than all the others combined: Darius Carter. Meanwhile, in room 207, Mrs. Drake moved through the lesson like a ghost. Her words lacked conviction, her eyes flickering to the clock every few minutes. She knew she would have to face the mayor. She knew the story of yesterday could unravel in an instant. When the lunch bell rang, the students filed out. Emily lingered, hesitating by Darius's desk. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. Darius zipped his bag calmly. "I am always ready." There was no arrogance in his tone, just quiet certainty. He stood and walked toward the hallway without looking back. As they reached the auditorium entrance, a wave of sound met them. Parents chatting, teachers greeting guests, the subtle hum of a crowd anticipating something important. Mrs. Cole, the librarian, spotted Darius and offered a small, encouraging smile. She had known all along there was more to him than most realized. Near the front row, the mayor himself stood in conversation with reporters. His presence was commanding yet warm, his tailored suit crisp, his expression composed. When he saw Darius approaching, his face softened into something rare, a quiet pride. "Son," the mayor said, placing a hand on Darius's shoulder. "Ready for your moment?" "Yes, sir," Darius replied. The exchange was brief but powerful. Around them, whispers rippled through the crowd. "That's his son? The boy from the school?" On the far side of the auditorium, Mrs. Drake entered silently. She kept to the shadows near the back, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She hadn't expected the mayor to be so present, so real, and now the weight of yesterday pressed heavier than ever. Principal Lawson stepped onto the stage, tapping the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this year's Academic Excellence Awards. Applause filled the room. Cameras clicked. As you know, Lawson continued, this ceremony honors the brightest minds of Roosevelt High, students who have shown exceptional dedication to learning and leadership. And today, we are honored to welcome Mayor Carter, who will personally recognize one of our top scholars. All eyes turned toward the mayor, who smiled briefly before stepping forward. Thank you, Principal Lawson, the mayor began. His voice carried a quiet authority. This school has always been a cornerstone of our community, and today it is my privilege to recognize a student whose hard work and resilience embody the very best of what this city stands for. He paused, letting the silence build. My son, Darius Carter. Gasps rippled through the auditorium. Heads turned. Teachers exchanged glances. Students whispered in shock. And in the very back row, Mrs. Drake felt her chest tighten. Darius walked calmly onto the stage, his posture straight, his face unreadable. The applause was loud, but beneath it, a different kind of silence settled, the silence of realization. Because in that moment, everyone understood what Mrs. Drake had done yesterday, and she knew the cameras were still rolling. The applause thundered through the auditorium, echoing off the walls like waves, but for Darius, it felt distant, muted. He stepped onto the stage with the same calm composure he had carried all day. His eyes didn't scan the crowd. He didn't search for familiar faces. He simply stood beside his father, waiting. Mayor Carter placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Darius has always believed that education is more than just memorizing facts. It's about integrity, about learning who you are, even when others may doubt you. The mayor's voice was steady, but beneath it was an edge of something deeper, something unspoken. In the back of the room, Mrs. Drake felt her breath catch. The words weren't directed at her, but they might as well have been. She could feel the weight of her actions from yesterday pressing down on her, heavier with every sentence. Principal Lawson smiled stiffly as he handed the mayor the award certificate. Cameras flashed. Today, the mayor continued, we honor students who not only excel academically, but who also represent the values of resilience and respect. My son, like many others here, has faced challenges, some visible, some unseen, but he has met them all with dignity. The crowd applauded again, but this time it was softer, more thoughtful. Darius took the certificate in his hands. He didn't give a speech. He didn't smile for the cameras. He simply nodded politely and stepped back beside his father. From the second row, Emily watched, her heart pounding. She wanted to stand up, to tell everyone what had happened in room 207, but fear pinned her to her seat. After the ceremony, as parents and students gathered in clusters for photos, Mrs. Drake slipped quietly toward the exit. But before she could leave, Principal Lawson intercepted her. Marlene, he said, his voice low but firm. We need to talk, now. She froze. Can it wait? No, Lawson replied. It can't. He led her to a small conference room off the side of the auditorium. Inside, he placed Darius's homework on the table. You hid this, he said flatly. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. I don't know if it was spite, bias, or just pride, Lawson continued, his tone harder now. But you crossed a line, and now the entire city is watching. Mrs. Drake's composure cracked. You don't understand. I understand enough, Lawson cut in. I understand that you singled out a student who did nothing wrong, and whether you knew it or not, that student is the mayor's son. The cameras are here, the reporters are here, and when they find out, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Darius stood with his father, surrounded by reporters. A journalist asked, Darius, how does it feel to be recognized by your school and your city today? Darius paused before answering. His eyes flicked briefly toward the conference room where he knew Mrs. Drake was. It feels like a reminder, he said quietly, that sometimes recognition comes only after you've been overlooked. The reporter blinked, unsure how to respond. The mayor placed a hand on his son's shoulder again. We'll talk more at home, he murmured. And somewhere in the back of the auditorium, Mrs. Drake realized this wasn't just about a piece of homework anymore. Tomorrow, her name would be the headline. The ceremony slowly dissolved into a mix of polite conversations and photo flashes. Students gathered with their families. Parents shook hands with teachers, and the faint buzz of admiration filled the room. But beneath the surface, an undercurrent of unease lingered. Darius stood quietly beside his father while more questions came from the reporters. Darius, do you plan to follow in your father's footsteps? One asked. He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. I plan to follow my own. The mayor chuckled softly, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the room. He had noticed the glances, the whispers, the way certain teachers avoided looking directly at his son. He filed it all away silently. Across the room, Emily approached cautiously, holding a folded piece of paper in her hands. Darius, she said softly, I wanted to give you this. He looked at her, curious. It's a statement, Emily whispered, about what happened in class yesterday. I wrote down everything I saw. If anyone asks, I'll tell them the truth. Darius's eyes softened for the first time that day. Thank you, he said quietly. But you don't have to get involved. I want to, Emily replied firmly. It wasn't right. Before he could respond, Principal Lawson appeared, his face tense. Darius, Mayor Carter, he said carefully. Could I have a moment with you both? The mayor nodded once. Of course. Lawson led them to a quieter hallway, away from the crowd. His voice dropped. I need you to know there was an incident yesterday. Mrs. Drake removed Darius from her class under false pretenses. The mayor's gaze sharpened. Go on. She claimed his homework wasn't turned in. It was. I found it hidden in her desk this morning, Lawson admitted. For a moment, silence stretched. The mayor didn't speak, but his expression hardened in a way that made Lawson shift uncomfortably. Thank you for telling me, the mayor said finally, his tone calm but edged with steel. Darius simply stood there, composed, as if none of this surprised him. Meanwhile, in the small conference room, Mrs. Drake sat alone, staring at the tabletop. Her mind replayed the scene from yesterday over and over. She tried to convince herself it wasn't personal, that she was simply maintaining standards. But deep down, she knew it had been more than that. When she finally stepped out into the hallway, she stopped dead in her tracks. Just a few feet away, she saw the mayor standing with Principal Lawson and Darius. Their quiet conversation was unmistakably serious. Her stomach twisted. Back in the auditorium, a reporter overheard snippets of conversation. Hidden homework, unfair expulsion, the mayor's son. It was enough to spark curiosity. She discreetly pulled out her phone and began typing notes. By the time the ceremony ended, the whispers had spread. Teachers exchanged uneasy glances. Students murmured to each other in corners. As the mayor and Darius prepared to leave, Mrs. Drake finally forced herself to step forward. "Mayor Carter," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I—" He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Yes," he said. She faltered. "I wanted to congratulate your son on his achievement." Darius looked at her with the same calm gaze he'd given her in class. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet understanding that made her feel smaller than any confrontation ever could. "Thank you," he said simply, and then turned away. The mayor gave Mrs. Drake one final glance, the kind that didn't need words to carry its weight, before walking out with his son. And just like that, the story was no longer contained within the walls of Roosevelt High. It was about to leave the building. By the time the mayor's car pulled away from Roosevelt High, the story had already started to grow legs. A reporter lingering near the exit had caught enough details, just fragments of overheard conversations and the subtle tension in the air, to sense that there was more beneath the surface. Within an hour, a vague post appeared on a local journalist's social media feed. Something troubling happened at Roosevelt High. A top student, honored today, may have been unfairly targeted by a teacher. Details to come. Inside the school, Principal Lawson returned to his office. He sat heavily in his chair, staring at the glowing screen of his computer. He knew the mayor wouldn't erupt in public outrage, not yet, but the quiet way he'd looked at Mrs. Drake before leaving said enough. It was the kind of silence that promised consequences. Mrs. Drake, meanwhile, remained in her classroom long after the final bell. The desks sat empty, the fading afternoon light casting long shadows across the floor. She gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles pale. She had thought she was in control yesterday, that her authority was unquestionable. Now, for the first time in years, she felt like the ground beneath her was shifting. Across town, in the mayor's car, Darius sat quietly beside his father. "Tell me exactly what happened," Mayor Carter said, his voice low, deliberate. "She said I didn't belong in her class," Darius replied calmly. "She said I made excuses. When I told her I'd turned in my work, she asked me to leave." The mayor's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Did you argue with her?" "No, I didn't need to." There was a pause. The mayor glanced at his son briefly, seeing the quiet strength in his face. "You handled it well," the mayor said finally, "but this isn't going to disappear. You know that." "I know," Darius said softly. Back at school, Emily stayed behind with a few other students. She couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at her. She had seen it all, and she had stayed silent until it was too late. When she left the building, she saw a reporter waiting outside the gates. "Excuse me," the reporter said gently. "You were at the ceremony, right? Can you tell me what happened?" Emily froze. I don't think I should." "Did something happen between that boy, Darius Carter, and a teacher?" the reporter pressed. Emily hesitated, then glanced back at the school. "He didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. "She just didn't like him." That was all the reporter needed. Later that evening, Principal Lawson received a call from the district office. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional. "We're getting inquiries about Roosevelt High," the caller said. "Something about a teacher, a scholarship student, and the mayor's son. Can you clarify what's going on before this becomes a story?" Lawson rubbed his forehead. "I'll prepare a statement." But before he could even draft one, his inbox pinged with a link to a local news article. "Roosevelt High honors mayor's son after alleged classroom incident with teacher." And the comments beneath it were already filling with anger. In her apartment that night, Mrs. Drake stared blankly at her television as the evening news replayed the ceremony. The camera zoomed in on the mayor standing proudly beside his son. The anchor's voice narrated, "Darius Carter, son of Mayor Thomas Carter, received the city's top academic honor today. Sources say the young scholar has overcome unique challenges to reach this milestone." Mrs. Drake turned the volume down, but it was too late. She already knew. Her name was next, and tomorrow the phone would start ringing. Morning came heavy with a strange quiet. Roosevelt High looked the same from the outside. Rows of red brick, the faded school banner swaying in the breeze. But something felt different. Before the first bell even rang, reporters had gathered near the gates. Their cameras rested casually on their shoulders, but their eyes scanned the crowd for any sign of Darius or the mayor. Students walked past, whispering nervously, unsure if they should look or hurry along. Inside, Mrs. Drake sat at her desk, staring blankly at her lesson plan. She hadn't slept much. Her phone had buzzed relentlessly the night before. Messages from colleagues, a few from old friends who had seen her name mentioned online. Nothing was direct yet, just hints. But she knew what was coming. At 8:15, Principal Lawson called an emergency staff meeting in the library. Teachers shuffled in, confused, clutching coffee cups. Lawson stood at the front, his face pale. "I'm sure you've all seen the news," he began. "We are under scrutiny. There are reports circulating about an incident between Mrs. Drake and Darius Carter, the mayor's son." A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. "This is now a district-level matter," Lawson continued. "Until further notice, Mrs. Drake will be placed on temporary administrative leave pending an internal review." All eyes turned to her. Mrs. Drake's face tightened, but she didn't speak. She simply gathered her papers slowly, deliberately, and left the room. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Darius moved calmly through the morning chaos. Students stepped aside to let him pass. Some whispered, some stared. Emily hurried to catch up. "Darius," she said breathlessly, "they're talking about it. Everyone knows now." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. It was never about whether they knew. It was about whether they cared enough to notice. Emily frowned. "Do you want her to get in trouble?" Darius didn't answer right away. "What I want," he said finally, "is for people to understand why it happened. Not just to me, to anyone who doesn't have someone to protect them." As the day went on, the whispers grew louder. Students checked their phones between classes. Headlines popped up everywhere. Teacher accused of unfair treatment toward mayor's son. Scholarship winner removed from class over homework dispute. By lunch, it was no longer a rumor. It was a story. In his office downtown, Mayor Carter sat at his desk, surrounded by advisors. "We don't want to escalate this," one of them said cautiously. "If we make it too public, it could look like we're using power to settle a personal matter." The mayor leaned back in his chair. This isn't personal. It's systemic. And I'm tired of silence protecting people like her. Back at Roosevelt, Mrs. Drake packed her belongings into a cardboard box. She moved slowly, methodically. For years, she had believed she was untouchable. That one student couldn't change the way the system worked. But now, she wasn't so sure. As she walked out of the building, a reporter snapped a photo. The caption went online within minutes. Teacher at center of Roosevelt High scandal leaves campus amid investigation. And in the comments below, the story began to grow beyond her. By the end of the week, Roosevelt High no longer felt like just a school. It felt like the center of something much larger. Local news vans lined the street outside. Parents lingered at drop-off, whispering in clusters. Students filmed snippets of the chaos on their phones. Reporters asking questions no one wanted to answer. Teachers hurrying past without making eye contact. Inside, Principal Lawson sat at his desk, staring at an overflowing inbox. Emails from the district, emails from parents, even a formal inquiry from the mayor's office. Each subject line felt heavier than the last. Request for statement. Clarification needed on incident involving student Carter. Urgent. Media coverage escalating. He rubbed his temples and let out a long sigh. Meanwhile, in the cafeteria, Emily sat across from Darius. She had been quieter than usual these past few days, watching how everything unfolded around him. "Do you want to say something?" she asked finally. Like, to the press? Darius shook his head. "It's not my voice they need to hear. It's theirs. The ones who stayed quiet." Emily looked down at her tray. She knew he meant her too. At a nearby table, other students debated in hushed tones. "Do you think she'll come back?" "No way, not after this. She always picked on people. Just no one important enough before." The words hung in the air, echoing exactly what Darius had said. Across town, Mayor Carter was carefully crafting his next steps. He wasn't interested in a public feud, but he also wasn't willing to let the matter fade quietly into the background. He had already received calls from community leaders demanding change. They weren't just asking for one teacher's resignation. They wanted a deeper look at the school's culture. That afternoon, an emergency school board meeting was held. The room was packed. Parents, teachers, even a few reporters. Principal Lawson stood at the front, reading a carefully worded statement. "We are committed to ensuring every student at Roosevelt High is treated with fairness and respect. The situation involving Mrs. Drake and Darius Carter is under thorough review. Appropriate actions will be taken once all facts are confirmed." A parent raised her hand. "Is it true she hid his homework?" Lawson hesitated. It was found ungraded in her desk. The room erupted into murmurs. "And how many times has this happened to other students?" another parent demanded. Lawson had no answer. Meanwhile, in her apartment, Mrs. Drake sat in silence, scrolling through endless comments on social media. Some defended her, claiming the media was exaggerating, but most condemned her. This is why kids stopped trusting teachers. If it wasn't the mayor's son, we'd never even know. She shut her laptop and buried her face in her hands. Back at the school, as students filed out for the day, a reporter stopped Emily just outside the gates. "You were in the class when it happened, right?" the reporter asked gently. Emily froze. Her heart pounded. For a moment, she thought about walking away. But then she remembered Darius's words. "It's about the ones who stayed quiet." Yes, she said finally. I saw everything. The reporter leaned in. Can you tell me what you saw? Emily took a deep breath. She lied, she said softly. He did the work. She just didn't want to see it. That single sentence became the lead in the evening news. And now, the story was no longer just about Darius. It was about every student who had been invisible. By the next morning, Emily's words were everywhere. Her brief statement from the school gates had been clipped, subtitled, and shared across social media. She lied. He did the work. She just didn't want to see it. The video spread quickly, not just in the city, but beyond it. Parents, educators, and former students began leaving comments, some sharing their own quiet stories of being dismissed or overlooked. What started as one classroom incident was becoming a mirror for something larger. At Roosevelt High, the atmosphere shifted again. Students walked in with a new kind of energy, some emboldened, some nervous. In the hallways, they whispered about the news segments playing on their parents' TVs. Principal Lawson held a staff meeting before first period. The district has called for an external review, he announced. They'll be interviewing students, teachers, and parents. This is no longer an internal matter. Some teachers nodded solemnly. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Meanwhile, Mrs. Drake hadn't shown up. She was officially on leave, but her absence felt louder than her presence ever had. Students noticed the empty classroom, the substitute teacher who spoke in soft tones and avoided questions. In the cafeteria, Emily sat next to Darius again. The noise around them was louder than usual. Students debating, arguing, even planning to speak to reporters themselves. You're not mad at me for talking to the news, are you? Emily asked, her voice unsure. No, Darius said calmly. You did what needed to be done. Emily looked at him, confused. But now everyone knows you're the mayor's son. Doesn't that make it worse? Like they'll say it only mattered because of who you are. Darius paused, then spoke carefully. It does matter, but not because I'm the mayor's son. It matters because it shows how many others didn't have someone to protect them. If this is what it takes for people to finally see, then so be it. Across town, Mayor Carter was meeting with the superintendent. This isn't about one teacher, the mayor said firmly. It's about a culture that allowed her to do this without question. How many students have been pushed aside because no one was watching? The superintendent shifted uncomfortably. We'll cooperate fully with the review. We'll reevaluate our policies. This isn't about policies, the mayor replied. It's about accountability. Back at the school, a local news crew set up near the entrance. A group of students gathered, holding hand-drawn signs. We deserve fairness. See all of us. Emily held one too. She didn't plan it. It just felt necessary. When the cameras started rolling, the reporter asked, "Why are you standing here today?" Emily spoke, her voice stronger now. Because Darius wasn't the first. He's just the one they couldn't ignore. Inside the building, Darius watched quietly from the window. He didn't smile, but something in his eyes softened. Meanwhile, in her apartment, Mrs. Drake scrolled through the headlines with trembling fingers. The media had stopped calling it an incident. Now, they called it a pattern. Former students speak out. We always knew she had favorites. District under pressure as discrimination claims surface. She closed her laptop, but the silence in her apartment felt louder than any headline. Tomorrow, the district investigators would arrive, and this time, No drawer could hide the truth. The district investigators arrived the next morning, their presence unmistakable. 3 of them, dressed in neutral suits, walked through the main entrance with clipboards in hand. The students watched as they passed, their whispers trailing like a wave. Principal Lawson greeted them at the door. His polite smile was thin, strained. "We've prepared a room for your interviews," he said. They nodded, offering no small talk. Word spread quickly. By mid-morning, students were being called one by one to the library for questioning. Each interview lasted only minutes, but when they returned, their faces were different. Some pale, some relieved, some thoughtful. Emily was called in just after lunch. She sat in a chair opposite 2 investigators, while the third took notes silently. "Tell us about the day Mrs. Drake sent Darius Carter out of class," one of them said gently. Emily hesitated, then drew a deep breath. "He didn't do anything wrong. She said he didn't turn in his homework, but I saw him put it on her desk. She told him he didn't belong there and made him leave." The investigator nodded slowly. "Did this happen before with other students?" "Yes," Emily whispered. "Not just Darius, other kids too. But they never said anything. They didn't think anyone would listen." When she left the room, her hands trembled slightly, but for the first time, she felt like the truth was no longer trapped in her chest. Meanwhile, Darius's turn came. He sat calmly in the same chair, his hands folded neatly on the table. "Darius," one investigator began, "how would you describe Mrs. Drake's behavior toward you?" Darius's eyes met theirs steadily. It wasn't about behavior, it was about belief. "She didn't believe someone like me deserved to be where I was." "And did you tell anyone at the time?" "No," Darius replied, "because I knew it wouldn't matter until someone important cared." The room was silent for a moment as the weight of his words settled. Across town, Mayor Carter was already in discussions with community leaders. Emails poured into his office from parents and alumni sharing similar stories, not just about Mrs. Drake, but about the system itself. "This is bigger than Roosevelt High," one advisor said. "Yes," the mayor agreed quietly. "It always was." At the end of the day, the investigators met privately with Principal Lawson. "We've gathered enough testimonies to confirm a pattern," one said flatly, "not just with Darius Carter, but with multiple students over the years." Lawson felt his chest tighten. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it undeniable. In her apartment, Mrs. Drake sat on her couch, staring at the folded box that still held her school belongings. She hadn't left her home since walking out of Roosevelt High. The calls had stopped now, replaced by silence. On the evening news, the anchor's voice was calm but cutting. The investigation into Roosevelt High reveals years of overlooked complaints. Former students speak of feeling dismissed, unseen. Now, the district faces pressure to address not just one teacher's actions, but the culture that allowed them. Mrs. Drake turned off the TV, but the darkness of the room offered no comfort. Meanwhile, Darius sat at his desk at home, quietly finishing another assignment. He didn't look at the headlines. He didn't need to, because he knew the story was no longer his alone. The following morning, Roosevelt High was quieter than it had ever been. Students moved through the halls in a hush, their voices low, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile balance holding everything together. Principal Lawson stood outside his office, greeting students with a strained smile. He could feel their eyes on him, filled with questions he didn't have answers for yet. Every step he took felt heavier, as though the weight of the entire school rested on his shoulders. In the library, the district investigators continued their work. They sifted through old records, looking for patterns, disciplinary reports, parent complaints, test scores. It didn't take long before they found what they suspected. Darius wasn't the only one. Dozens of files, spanning years, showed the same quiet trend. Students from similar backgrounds consistently marked down for behavioral issues, their grades questioned, their efforts dismissed. None of it screamed misconduct on paper, but when placed side by side, it painted an undeniable picture. Meanwhile, in the cafeteria, Emily sat with a group of classmates. The air buzzed with conversation. "Did you hear? They're reopening old cases," one student whispered. "I always knew she was unfair," another muttered. "She just never got caught." Emily stayed quiet, staring at her tray. She couldn't stop thinking about Darius. He hadn't raised his voice once through all of this. He hadn't demanded anything. He just let the truth unfold on its own. Outside the school, news vans lined the curb. A reporter went live, her voice carrying a sharp edge. What started as a single classroom dispute has now uncovered a pattern of bias at Roosevelt High. Parents are demanding answers, while the district promises reform. But for many, it raises a larger question. How many other schools have similar stories waiting to be uncovered? Across town, Mayor Carter was already fielding calls from community leaders. His office was flooded with emails, messages from families who had experienced the same quiet injustice but lacked the platform to speak out. "This is no longer about one teacher," the mayor said during a closed-door meeting. "This is about the structure that allowed it. We need systemic accountability." Back at Roosevelt, Principal Lawson gathered the faculty for an emergency meeting after school. The room was tense. "The investigators will finish by the end of the week," Lawson announced. "Their report will determine the next steps. But understand this, it won't just be about Mrs. Drake. It will be about all of us. About what we allowed to happen under our watch." Some teachers nodded solemnly. Others avoided eye contact, shifting in their seats. Meanwhile, at home, Mrs. Drake sat by the window, staring out at the empty street. Her phone buzzed with another notification. This time, a headline that made her stomach twist. "District finds years of discriminatory practices at Roosevelt High." She read the words twice before setting the phone down, her hands trembling. And across town, Darius sat at the dinner table with his father. He pushed his finished homework aside as the mayor looked at him. "You know," the mayor said quietly, "this will change things. Not just for you, but for others." Darius met his father's gaze. "I didn't want to change things for me. I wanted them to see everyone they ignored." The mayor didn't respond. He just nodded, understanding more than words could hold. Tomorrow, the investigators would release their preliminary findings, and no one would be able to look away anymore. The next day, the school board released a brief statement before noon. It was only 2 paragraphs, but it sent a ripple through the entire community. Preliminary findings indicate a pattern of discriminatory behavior towards certain students at Roosevelt High. The investigation is ongoing. Immediate steps are being taken to address the matter and ensure accountability. Within hours, the media amplified it. Headlines spread across local news sites. Investigation confirms bias at Roosevelt High. Parents demand answers after years of neglect. Outside the school, parents gathered in clusters, their voices raised, not in anger alone, but in long suppressed frustration. Many held old memories of their own children being brushed aside. Inside the building, Principal Lawson moved through the hallways like a shadow. He knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Every corner of the school now felt like it held a secret ready to surface. Emily walked past the bulletin boards, feeling the shift in the air. Students who had once stayed silent now spoke openly. Remember when she told Marcus he'd never make it to college? He just stopped trying after that. And Kayla? She got detention for asking a question too many times in class. The stories piled on, each one sharpening the truth. Meanwhile, Darius sat quietly in the library, the same table, the same calm posture. But this time, students joined him, not out of pity, but solidarity. A few sat down across from him with their own stories. "I never told anyone," a boy admitted softly, "but she failed me once for something I didn't do. I thought, maybe I really wasn't smart enough." Darius listened, his expression steady. "You were always smart enough. She just didn't want to see it." Outside the school, Mrs. Drake's apartment was surrounded by silence. She hadn't stepped out in days. A single envelope lay unopened on her kitchen table. It was from the district, marked confidential. She already knew what it would say. Across town, Mayor Carter stood at a press conference. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed in his direction. "This is not just about my son," he said firmly. "This is about every child who has been made to feel lesser. Every student whose potential was ignored because someone decided they didn't belong. We will not allow this to continue. Not in this school. Not in this city." His words were deliberate, echoing across the room. Back at Roosevelt, Principal Lawson called another faculty meeting. His voice was heavier now. "The district will begin staff evaluations next week. Anyone found complicit in dismissing or covering these issues will face consequences. We are restructuring, and that includes how we see our students, all our students." Some teachers nodded solemnly. Others exchanged worried glances. When the meeting ended, Emily found Darius waiting outside the library. "They're listening now," she said softly. "Are they?" Darius asked. His voice calm, but with a trace of something deeper. Caution, perhaps. "They're starting to," Emily corrected. He gave a small nod. "Then maybe it's a start." That evening, the news ran a segment with old photos of students who had quietly left Roosevelt High over the years. The anchor's voice was quiet, but cutting. For some, the damage was silent. For others, it ended opportunities before they even began, and for too long, no one noticed. In her darkened apartment, Mrs. Drake turned off the TV. But she couldn't turn off the truth. By midweek, Roosevelt High had become a symbol far beyond the city. News outlets from neighboring states picked up the story. Talk shows debated it. Community forums erupted online, and parents from other districts began sharing eerily similar stories. At the school gates, a group of former students gathered, holding handwritten signs that read, "We remember." It wasn't just one teacher. Reporters moved among them, asking quiet questions, their cameras rolling. Inside the library, investigators met with Principal Lawson one last time. "We're finalizing the report," one of them said, closing a thick folder. "The findings won't just name individuals. It will address the institutional gaps that allowed this to happen." Lawson nodded, his expression tired. "I understand." In the cafeteria, Emily sat across from Darius again. She noticed how calm he remained despite the chaos swirling around them. "Do you ever feel angry?" she asked. Darius looked at her for a long moment. "Anger doesn't fix anything," he said softly. "It just reminds you something needs to change. I'd rather focus on the change." Emily hesitated. "Do you think she regrets it, Mrs. Drake?" Darius gave the faintest shrug. "Maybe. But regret doesn't erase what was done. It only matters what happens next." Across town, in the mayor's office, a private meeting was underway. Community leaders, school board members, and city officials sat in a circle of tense discussion. "We need more than apologies," one parent demanded. "We need real reform, teacher training, accountability, transparency. We can't rebuild trust overnight," a district representative argued. Mayor Carter leaned forward. "No, but we can start by admitting the truth. This wasn't a single mistake. It was years of silence, and silence is no longer acceptable." Meanwhile, Mrs. Drake sat in her apartment, staring at the letter she had avoided opening for days. Her fingers trembled as she finally tore the envelope. "Effective immediately. Your employment at Roosevelt High School is terminated pending further review. You are not to return to campus during this period." The words blurred for a moment as she lowered the paper. She thought about the years she had spent at the school, the authority she once held, the certainty she once felt. Now, it all seemed hollow. On the evening news, another headline appeared: "District to implement sweeping changes after Roosevelt High investigation." The segment showed Mayor Carter standing in front of City Hall. "This is not about one teacher losing a job," he said. "This is about making sure no child is ever made to feel invisible again." That same night, a candlelight gathering formed outside Roosevelt High. Parents, students, and alumni stood silently, holding candles that flickered against the cool air. They didn't chant. They didn't shout. They just stood, a collective reminder that they were watching now. Emily joined the group, holding a candle of her own. Beside her, Darius stood quietly, his face illuminated by the soft glow. "You didn't have to come," Emily whispered. "Yes, I did," Darius said, "because this isn't about me anymore. It's about everyone they tried not to see." For the first time, Emily saw something in his expression. Not anger, not pride, but quiet strength that carried beyond the moment. Tomorrow, the final report would be public, and nothing would be the same again. The morning the report was released, Roosevelt High felt suspended in a strange quiet. Students still filled the halls, but their conversations were hushed, nervous. Teachers avoided eye contact, moving quickly from classroom to classroom. In the main office, Principal Lawson printed the district's official findings. The words were clear, stripped of any soft language. A consistent pattern of discriminatory behavior has been documented. Numerous complaints over the years were ignored or inadequately addressed. Roosevelt High failed to protect its students from bias, resulting in academic and emotional harm. He read the lines twice before folding the report neatly and setting it on his desk. There was no denying it anymore. Outside, news vans crowded the curb. Reporters spoke into microphones as cameras panned across the school. Today, the district officially confirmed systemic bias at Roosevelt High. Former teacher Marlene Drake has been terminated, and further evaluations of staff and policies are underway. But for many families, this is only the beginning of a much larger reckoning. In the cafeteria, Emily scrolled through her phone, reading the statement again and again. Students around her whispered, "Did you see? It's everywhere now. They're talking about her on the radio. My mom said they might replace half the staff." She glanced up and saw Darius sitting alone at a table by the window. Even now, with the entire school and city talking about him, he seemed unchanged, calm, centered. She walked over and sat beside him. "It's over now," she said quietly. "No," Darius replied, his eyes still on the window. "It's just beginning. They'll talk about it for a while, then they'll move on. But the question is, what stays changed after they stop looking?" Emily frowned, thinking about his words. Across town, Mayor Carter held another press conference. The building steps were lined with reporters, cameras flashing as he spoke. "This report is not the end," he said firmly. "It's a reminder of how silence allows harm to grow unnoticed. Policies will change. Training will change. But culture only changes when we keep watching. We won't stop watching." That evening, a community forum was held in the school auditorium. Parents packed the seats, many holding notebooks and prepared questions. Teachers sat scattered, some defensive, others somber. The district superintendent stood at the podium. "We are implementing mandatory equity training for all staff. A new oversight committee will be formed, and we will be reopening old cases to ensure justice for those who were wronged." From the back row, a parent stood. "And what about the students who already left? The ones who lost years because no one listened?" The superintendent hesitated. "We will do what we can to reach them." Back in her apartment, Mrs. Drake watched the live stream of the forum on her phone. The faces of parents and students filled the screen, their voices raw with long-held frustration. She muted the sound and stared at the flickering image, realizing she no longer recognized the world she had helped create. Meanwhile, outside the school, another quiet gathering formed. Former students brought photos and letters, placing them along the fence. Emily joined them. Darius arrived last, walking with the same quiet presence he always carried. He looked at the letters, at the photos of kids who'd left Roosevelt and never returned. "This is their story too," he said softly. Emily nodded, and now people finally see it. Tomorrow would bring more headlines, more reforms, more promises. But tonight, the candles burned brighter than the cameras. The final day of the investigation felt strangely calm. Roosevelt High stood quiet under a gray sky, the kind that muted every color into softer shades. There were no more reporters crowding the gates, no more frantic whispers in the hallways. Instead, there was a kind of stillness, like the school itself was holding its breath. In the library, students gathered around the table where Darius often sat. There were no cameras now, no speeches, just quiet conversations. Emily sat beside him, flipping through her notebook. "They're saying the district is bringing in new staff," she said softly. "New policies. Everything's going to look different next year." Darius nodded slightly. It might look different, he replied, but what matters is if it feels different for the kids sitting in these seats after us. Emily looked at him, realizing he was already thinking beyond himself, beyond the moment. In the principal's office, Lawson signed the final set of papers, letters of reassignment, notifications of staff training schedules, memos to parents. He paused for a moment before placing his pen down. He had been in this job for over a decade, and for the first time, he felt like he was seeing his school clearly, not as it appeared on paper, but as it had been in reality. Across the city, Mayor Carter attended one last community meeting. The room was filled with parents and former students, their voices steady but demanding. "We will continue to hold every school accountable," the mayor promised. "What happened at Roosevelt will not be ignored, and it will not be repeated. Not here, not anywhere else in this city." When the meeting ended, a quiet round of applause rose, not celebratory, but resolute. Meanwhile, Mrs. Drake packed the last of her belongings into a single cardboard box. The apartment was silent, except for the sound of tape tearing. She glanced one final time at the framed certificate she had once been proud of. Now, it felt meaningless. She placed it in the box without a word and closed the lid. Back at Roosevelt High, the final bell of the day echoed down the hallways. Students filed out slowly, lingering by the doors. Some stayed behind in the courtyard, where the letters and photos left by former students still lined the fence. Darius stood among them, reading a handwritten note someone had left. It simply said, "I thought I wasn't good enough. Turns out, I just wasn't seen." He folded the note carefully and placed it back where he found it. Emily joined him. "What now?" she asked quietly. Darius looked at the school one last time. "Now we make sure they keep looking. That's the only way it changes." As the sun dipped behind the buildings, the candles from the previous night were relit by a few remaining students. Their flames flickered softly in the growing dusk, small but unyielding. No speeches were given. No one asked for attention. They simply stood there, letting the quiet carry what words couldn't. For the first time, Roosevelt High felt different, not because the story had ended, but because the silence was no longer empty. It was full of the voices that had finally been heard, and this time, no one would forget.